Welcome everyone to Exploring Responsibly, a live conversation series that traverses our sense of accountability, our actions, and our philosophies around our relationships with nature and the world. The conversations happen live on Instagram and are then saved and redistributed in the hopes to reach more folks like you. I'm Gabachia, your host, and I want to thank you for being here.
So let's go for it. I want to thank you all and welcome you all to episode 5 of Exploring Responsibly. I'm Gabachia, your host. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am tuning in live from the land of the Pueblo people and the Jicarilla Apache people, also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. Exploring Responsibly is a live conversation series that traverses our sense of accountability, our actions, and our philosophies around our relationships with nature and the world. Today, we'll be covering topics at the intersections of art, critical psychology, community, and ancestral Indigenous knowledge. All thank you to our guest, Angela Mictlanxochitl, who is about to join. And while she's coming on, oh, hi.
Hey.
Hi, hermana. So I wanted to read a little bit of your bio because I think it's so beautiful. So Angela recently completed her doctorate at the California Institute of Integral Studies with her thesis project, which is something that I'm really excited about talking tonight. Um, which is titled Testimonio, Acknowledged Production Among Transterritorial Mexican and Mexican American Indigenous Spiritual Practitioners, a Decolonial, Participatory, and Grassroots Postmodernist Inquiry. And I'm so excited to learn how you do this work around communities, bridging Indigenous knowledge, art-based inquiry, and critical psychology. So thanks so much for joining me tonight, Angela. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's been a busy day, so I just wanted to offer some sage to sort of ground our energies.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's spring is renewal, but I think also things can kind of get all bunched up, and a lot of things are brought to the surface sometimes. So, with the permission of all the spirits and all the directions, and the permission of all the beautiful hearts that are joining us via Instagram. All the energies that guide and bless you, Gabi, and your camino. I just want to give thanks and gratitude to be alive, to be survivors, and to have this space to talk about exploring responsibly. Ometeo.
Ometeo. Thank you so much for that.
Ometeo.
Yes, I am receiving all of this beautiful blessing. Thank you. Why don't we start with you in a as long as needed sentence telling us who is Angela?
Wow, that's a big question. Angela is a spirit being who's doing her best to honor her lineages, to honor the contradictions of being a part of a colonial settler sort of dynamic, and the privileges of my education, the privileges that I have to travel and transport myself to different places and spaces of encounter. I'm also a very vulnerable and sensitive human being who it doesn't take a lot for tears to come out of these eyes. And I want to think it's because of the compassion that I've been trying to cultivate in myself, thanks to my spiritual work in the Camino. And also, most importantly, to all the beautiful people in my life who've opened up my heart and my knowing in so many ways. And that stretches from the Central Valley of California, where I was born and raised, to experiences at Notre Dame, to Bolivia, back to Chicago, San Francisco, and now here in Mexico, and many, many more in between all of that. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think I hope to be somebody of love and caring and sharing. So
Beautiful. And I think you are, at least to me.
aw.
At least to me, you are. And I want to just to let everybody know that I've known Angela now for whew, 10, maybe 12 years, maybe even more.
More.
And while we have only physically crossed paths maybe 5 times, I have always felt like this very deep connection and sisterhood and beautiful energy around you. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you making the time to connect virtually and share a little bit of that with my community and your community as well. So my next question is what I ask everyone that comes on the show, and it is, what does exploring responsibly mean to you?
That's easier to answer. And I think, you know, for me, exploring responsibly is sort of, you know, the heart of my doctoral work, the questions that encouraged and motivated me to do the work and to sort of go on this journey. And exploring responsibly is knowledge of self, knowledge of my relations, and knowledge of colonial and settler politics, sort of all of the power dynamics that inhibit or challenge us to be responsible in our space, in this world, in our relations with one another.
Whoa, that's gonna be a hard one to top, but I'm going to agree. I think that's definitely spot on. I love that you brought up the, you know, knowledge of self and in the relationships of everything else, and specifically the colonial politics that we inhabit and that are part of the duality that you were talking about, how, you know, we exist in this complex arena of especially as brown people, right? We have a history of being oppressed, and what does that mean as we're trying to make a name for ourselves and inhabit this world and participate in these systems that we didn't choose to have to begin with. So I appreciate that a lot. How did you arrive at connecting with your lineage and seeking that ancestral Indigenous guidance?
You know, I think we're all born with it. I think, you know, it's kind of, it's like a seed, and when it finds the right time to sprout, it comes out. And for me, I think that started when I went to Bolivia for the first time when I was an undergraduate. I went to Bolivia to work with small Christian communities based out of the liberation theology model in the Catholic Church. And what I loved about that model was that it was all about sort of thinking for yourself and acting for yourself. In that context, it was based on the scriptures, but I think being surrounded and embedded in an indigenous state and cosmology, something cosmic or mystical happened within my being that made me question who I was and how I was becoming in the world. And when I came back from Bolivia, I was unsettled. I wasn't at ease with myself. I even remember when I was in Bolivia, I called a good friend of mine who's now in spirit world, Father Don McNeil, and I'm like, I can't say I'm not worthy in the mass. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And from that moment, I kept on asking, well, why am I doubting my worthiness in the world? Like, I was aware I'm a biracial woman. And so growing up biracial, I understood, like, I was the güerita in the familia, and I never understood what that was and why I wasn't Mexican enough sometimes. So when I came back to the US and I was doing my graduate work, I the same man, Father Don, introduced me to a mentor, Sylvia Puente. And and I started to read the book Bless Mi Ultima by Ruri Acuña, who just passed away a couple of months ago. And what I loved about the book, which is also a movie if you haven't seen it, is that the character Ultima is a curandera. And I was fascinated and drawn to her persona because she brought in sort of something I think we forget, which is an earth spirituality. You know, how do we relate to the land? How do we connect to the spirit of each day, the rising sun and the moon and, you know, the animals? But at the same time, I was very grounded in a way where I didn't want to sort of go on this quest to find an ultima. But I simply just made a prayer. Like I want to shift in my spirituality. If anything, I want to come back into my spirituality and not be a part of an institution. And at that time, I was invited to a Latina leadership conference in California. And before I was living in Chicago, so I saw my family, and I was gifted a few things. One, I already had a drum that I had made due to the work I was doing, some sweat lodge work I was doing. And then when I came home, my dad gifted me this Virgen de Milagros, the miracle virgin, like a, you know, she was maybe about this size. And my mom gifted me like boots and like a ranchera hat. And so I arrived in this like professional setting with like top-notch executive Latina leaders from out the country, like with a drum, a virgen, and a ranchera hat on. And they were like, what the heck is this? One, I was young, and then two, with my whole get up. And but it was, you know, things happen in a way that I think are important, because my dad's mother was a curandera. She was a white lady, but she was a spiritual kind of woman in where we came from. And for me, the way that I narrated is that thanks to having the Virgen, having the drum, and having the rachenda, it was kind of all these parts of me coming together that ultimately led me to my spiritual teacher, Rosa Yaldaunocotli, who gravitated to me right away, and at the end of that encuentro invited me to a Lakota Sundance ceremony. And I said yes. Like, I didn't ask where, how, what, nada. It's like, yes. And 3 months later, I was driving 14 hours to Minnesota to go into a ceremony that completely changed my life. And from that ceremony, it took me to Moondance back to Mexico, where I entered another sort of a process of initiation within the Mesoamerican tradition. And yeah, there's tons of stories since that point. It's been over 15 years ago that happened. So.
Wow, that sounds like a really powerful moment in your life. With you saying that you were invited into this Lakota space, I immediately had this question of, how do we respectfully come into those sacred spaces? Obviously, an invitation, I feel like it's appropriate and necessary, but after that invitation, how do you approach that kind of space that, you know, like you said, we all have it in us, but there's a lot of identity politics that come at play. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think coming in as somebody who doesn't know anything, one has to be very, very careful and mindful. I was fortunate to have my madrina as a guide to kind of be, she was there to receive me. She was there to instruct me. And she always reminded me of the frase, calladita te ves más bonita, like quietly you look more cute and approachable, right? And so for me, that's kind of been my MO when I go into spaces that I'm not familiar with. I'm not familiar with the tradition. I'm a guest. Is I listen, I observe, and I offer my support. I offer my service. But even then, I try to be very mindful of when to do that, because I don't want to come off as pushy, come off as trying to appropriate. or yeah, it's like going to somebody's house. You don't start going looking in somebody's cupboards or cabinets or looking around the house. You sit down and you wait to sort of be instructed. And then sometimes they need help with something, so you are there to assist and to help when they need. And through sort of the waiting, the listening, the observing, you know, little by little, people will start to approach you, and that's when you start to have conversations. And it could be random stuff, but that's the relationship building part. And I think when you start to build a relationship with the community, the land, the ceremony, whatever it may be, that's when we start to learn how to be more responsible and respectful in that space, and whether or not you should be there. Because I think sometimes just because we arrive doesn't mean that we necessarily need to be in that space as well. And I was actually confronted with that question in the middle of the ceremony, because some things happened at a spiritual level, and I chose to stay because I was given a responsibility, and I didn't want to let go of my responsibility. And it was a vulnerable position because I didn't know anybody. But I earned a lot of respect from the people there because I chose to stay. So.
Wow, thank you for sharing those kind of guidelines. I think, yeah, as we approach things with respect, I think the mindfulness of not taking up space where it's not ours to take is really important. When you talk about building relationship with the people and the land, how do you see that play in the communities that you're a part of, or the communities that you come in contact with?
Yeah, it's funny you use the word play, because I think a lot of it is play. I think I always feel like I'm guided by my guardianes, by animal spirits. And so particularly when you have to travel a long distance to get somewhere, you start to notice things, right? Or if you get lost, like the first time I went to Sundance, I didn't know where I was going. I got lost, but it took me to where I needed to be in order to find out where I needed to go, you know? I think you also learn to sort of pay attention, like to look at the sky, to see, you know, what's presenting itself. But I think before I leave anywhere, I always ask permission, and I ask for protection. Because there's all different types of entities, just like there's all different types of communities everywhere we go. And I try to be very cognizant of sort of the different realms that we're activating when we go into spiritual space. So I usually ask permission, like I burn sage or I offer tobacco. I let other people know where I'm going to sort of collect information or to get instructions. And when I arrive somewhere, you know, I give thanks for arriving in the place. And then I usually take an offering to whoever it is that I'm seeing. So it could be things that they requested, it could be tobacco, it could be food, but I don't like to, I try not to have empty hands. It's always having something. It's for the people, but it's also for the land, you know, even if it's just putting a little bit of water on the ground, but it's making some type of contact and exchange to give thanks, and then to ask for that continued support and protection and opening. That essentially I think we're seeking when we go to a destination or we meet with people.
And these practices, and I've been so privileged to have been on the receiving end of one of your offerings during that beautiful blood moon in Joshua Tree a couple of years ago. Are these practices that you learn and adopted from your mentors, or are these practices that you have been kind of crafting on your own? How has that been for you?
Yeah, I think most of it I've learned from my mentors, from my guides. It's you know, the going to a place, listening, observing, but obviously I put my special touch on it, right? I offer my vital energy to whatever it is that I'm doing. And so I think that's sort of the creativeness and also whatever inspiration. And I think it's really beautiful when you're able to offer somebody something. It can be really simple. It doesn't have to be extravagant. And they're like, wow, I've been wanting this, or how did you know? And so for me, those are the little affirmations that I'm doing things in a good way. And sometimes I ask, what do you need? And that helps too.
Absolutely. I have a story from last year. I did my first long backpacking trip.
Mm-hmm.
And the first couple of days were really intense. And there was a lot of like internal, external resistance, right? Like the elements, being alone on the trail for the longest time I was ever going to be. And around day 3, I landed on this beautiful but very intimidating landscape, and it was a beautiful canyon, and it just looked like great bear country, which also made it intimidating. I could tell that I was the only person there for a couple miles probably. And as I got to the place where I was going to pitch my tent, I realized that this resistance didn't make any sense, that I had to connect.
Mm-hmm.
And intuitively, I decided that when I am backpacking or hiking or anything, I need to acknowledge the forces and the spirits and all the beings that have cared for that land and that still care for that land and that have been connected to that land. And so I kind of made a little gratitude prayer that then I continue to do every night. And it just brought me so much peace. And I cannot even tell you how my trip kind of flipped 360 degrees after that. Just, I didn't, it was just internal. It was just that prayer and that making that acknowledgement made the entire difference for me.
Yeah, because everything around you is alive. It's listening, it's feeling, and I think the universe wants to conspire in our favor, right? And if we don't ask, we can't get that help. And I think that goes with anything, at home, on a trail, in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, and if anything too, I think one, it's our surroundings want to help us, but also it allows us to help ourselves, right? Because what you just shared is you acknowledge a moment, you know what, something's not right. I need to help myself. And so that prayer emerged, and that is one of your tools, one of your amulets that is there to be sort of that stick or whatever it may be to get you to move forward. So that's amazing.
Yeah, that was pretty special to me. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad I was able to get to that moment. I want to go back to kind of the beginning of our conversation when you spoke about not being Mexican enough because of being biracial.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you feel like you are Mexican enough, or how has that evolved in how you hold your identity?
Yeah, I don't think I ask if I'm enough anymore, because I'm very, very unique, just as all of us are unique. And identity is a construct, right? It's a colonial and a settler construct as well, meant to it discourages us in many ways. Um, Obviously, I have an affinity and a deep respect and love for what Mexico is. I'm living in Mexico now, but I realize that Mexican is many things as well. it's a whole panorama of things. And so for me, you know, the transterritorial spirituality is really about who I am, right? It's about how do I relate my knowledge of self, my knowledge of my relations, and my knowledge of my settler colonial complicity to be confident in how I show up in the world and the things that I choose to do. So I have to acknowledge the biracialness. I have to acknowledge sort of my Mexican lineage and heritage. I have to acknowledge my U.S. Identity as well, because we live in a system that we have to navigate, and because of there's injustices and discriminations and so forth. You know, I'm very sort of practical. I like to be very practical. But at the same time, in spaces like this, I also want to advance a narrative that allows us to be in other forms of expression, right? Sometimes, like what I love about your practice is movement and dance. You know, you can say so much. I was talking to students from Guam the other day, and they opened up with this beautiful chant and dance that told me so much more about who they were than their words can express. And so I think that's what I'm striving for, right? Is how can I show up and be who I am without having to say anything? And that's, I think, goes back to like the offerings I try to make with people. And like I said, I try to be loving, caring, and sharing. And if I can do that, you know, I'm in a good place. And the loving, the caring, and sharing is obviously nurtured by my lineages. It's nurtured by my experiences that come from the U.S., that come from Mexico, but also comes from places I've occupied. Sometimes it's a trail, sometimes it's a ceremony, sometimes it's relationships to people. Maybe it's a certain type of food that I like. It can be so many things. And so who I am and my identity is in transterritorial spirituality is really about sort of knocking that all down and really acknowledging sort of the multiplicity and the multiple dimensions of who we are and who I can be.
Wow. Yes. Yes. So much. Yes. I saw all those hearts and I agree is, always so much yes to everything that you so generously share, with me and today with us. So, segue fully into transterritorial spirituality. How did you approach your studies before your doctorate, and how do you arrive at dedicating your theses to kind of directly relate to this personal experience of yours with transterritorial spirituality? And it may be best to maybe describe transterritorial spirituality before we go into that bigger question.
Sure. Well, yeah, in my dissertation, I use transterritorial ancestral spirituality, but I think transterritorial spirituality also embodies what it is. But in academia, the more words you use, the the better off.
Yeah.
But essentially, transterritorial spirituality is all about sort of activating a space of encounter for those seeking an ancestral spirituality while working through the intersections of colonial and settler knowing. And the goal of it for me is to liberate our psychic and embodied knowing. So that's transterritorial spirituality in a nutshell. When I never pursued a PhD because I wanted to be a doctor. I did it because I needed a space of refuge, because entering my spiritual path, my camino, the sun dance and moon dance turned my world upside down. Like literally, like I lost my home, I lost my job, so many things. And because I'm not a person of expansive means, the US offers us the opportunity to pursue an education where we can get loans or grants or things like that kind of gives us that space to ask questions. And so I approached my doctorate from a very sort of selfish kind of place, like I just need refuge right now to figure out what's going on and what do I want to do about it. And originally, you know, I think being in an academic setting, I kept on doing being back and forth, like kind of getting caught up in the game of academics, like, oh, I want to do this study about art and performance and blah blah blah, but something would tug at me. I'm like, that's not why you're here, right? So it brought me back to my community and the people that I've been experiencing this path with, and I kept on bumping heads with the the the, the scholarship, because our stories weren't represented. What I was experiencing with my Moondance and Sundance sisters was not represented, or this whole talk of evolution of consciousness and, you know, evolutionary psychology. I think it sounds good in principle, but when I reflect on my community, it's like, well, we already know this. This already exists. There's no evolution to it, right? And so my doctoral work was trying to figure out, okay, how do I capture the stories and what my community is learning via our experiences with one another in a way where I don't subjugate or objectify their knowledge, in a way that I feel responsible for what I have to say and who I am as a scholar, which is very, very scary, because as soon as you put your thoughts out there, you're open to criticism. And it's, you know, cultural studies in general is very polemic, regardless of what you're talking about. And then two, I was trying to bridge these conversations between Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and that doesn't happen very often. And so I was lucky, and honestly, like I engaged in research ceremony, and a lot of Sean Wilson's work really inspired and encouraged me to do that. And I don't think my dissertation kind of wrote itself. Like I would think, well, what do I do now? And I would go and I'd find the book, or someone would mention it. It would just be the perfect, it all kind of just kept coming together. And what I developed was what I called a caracol methodology, where I approached my research in 3 phases. And so I did the phase of, you know, collecting all of the background work of people and so forth. Well, that's literature, that doesn't have to do with it. What I did was I leaned on the work of this phenomenal writer named Svetlana Alexievich, who does this work of oral testimonies. And one thing that she did with her work is she started to write books where it was just the voices of the people she was talking to. And she focused on women and children in sort of war-torn areas of Eastern Europe. And no one ever talks to the women and the children after a war. So that was one that was phenomenal. And two, you open the book and it's their voices. The author's voice, all she does is curate what she heard. And I was very moved by that, because I wanted the people in my community to be listened to, right? Often in academic work, people are talking at us. And I just wanted an opportunity to, again, to create that space of encounter and listen to what my community is sharing. Like I just told you how I came into my spiritual path. They shared that with me. And how can you not be enthralled and brought into that? And so I wanted to share that moment with people. And then the second phase was me taking responsibility as a scholar practitioner, right? So, you know, I heard all this stuff, but what do I think about it? And I kind of like give myself a carte blanche and said, okay, Angela, it's time for you to own up and speak. And so I just wrote, and I wrote from a very honest, transparent place. My knowledge may be right or wrong, and that's okay. And I think that's part of it too, is that a transterritorial spirituality isn't about like one truth, it's about multiple truths, and about how in contemporary times, when we access and reclaim knowledge, we're going to get some things wrong, and that's okay. And I think if we don't put it out there, we don't create the possibility for someone to say, hey, well, have you thought about it this way? Or actually, you know, things are this way. And that's where the learning, sort of the liberation process for me is at. And then the last sort of tier of that was, you know, the theoretical concept, which is the transterritorial spirituality, which I just spoke to, is really creating a more expansive space for us to have these conversations, right? I'm not seeking a utopic world. I'm not seeking like the right answers. There's not one way to be like a Mexica. There's not one way to be a Chicano or a Mexican spiritual practitioner. There's many ways, and there's so many different things happening. But at the same time, I think we have to be critically reflexive with one another. If we don't engage in that exercise with one another, the possibility to do a lot of damage or repeat sort of colonial settler habits and practices can occur. And so, yeah, there's a definite sort of activism to, I think, the work in a way to challenge one on an individual level and hopefully to challenge communities as well.
Wow. How did academia respond to this? Like what was it like to defend a work that was based in so much part in people's stories versus just theories?
Well, my defense went great because everybody, my community was there and everybody loved it. And I'm a good scholar, so I backed up all my stuff, right? But I did have some hiccups. Part of my chapters are written, the first tier is all in Spanish. And I remember my advisor saying, well, this is a US institution, you need to put it in English. And I'm like, no. And part of me didn't even want to translate it, but I gave in and I translated it and I put it in a whole other chapter. But just honoring sort of the language that was spoken, I think was a rupture in the academia. I think too, I'm very, very critical of transpersonal psychology and decoloniality. And I went to a summer institute at Duke in North Carolina at one point with some of like the lead decolonial scholars. And I mean, I was well received, but I wanted to switch things up. Like I didn't want to be in the classroom with the projector and so forth. So I'm like, can we go outside? Can I do my presentation outside? Because I wanted to burn some copal, open up with the directions. And of course, like they were mowing the lawn and like some people were just didn't get it. But to me, that was a perfect moment because my scholarship isn't about everybody getting it. It's about the people that it needs to reach. It's a very much of a living organism spirit. And so, yeah, it's been weird and exhilarating and frustrating. But at the beginning, I was really angry. And then towards the end, I'm like, I can't, it's not worth being angry at this very superficial stuff, at letters on a page. And so the work of Gloria Anzaldúa actually helped me reclaim the process for myself and have the courage to sort of create a methodology that works for me. And thanks to this work, and one of my committee members, we're actually writing a chapter now talking about reclaiming inquiry as care. Yeah.
Tell us more.
Yeah. I mean, what started us to talk about is like sort of how do we write and record how friendship inspires our work and sustains the work that we do, right? Because often we just focus on the outcome. But I know without my friends and the conversations I have, I don't know if I'm able to do things. Yes, as Vanessa says, from coraje to courage. And our friends are so important to that. And so we were talking about more of like a friendship epistemology, but then we got an opportunity to look at it from a social justice research perspective. And again, I think often research forces us to relive our traumas, and we want to create an invitation for people not to do that. So, or how do you think about your research from a caring perspective rather than just sort of coming to show your point perspective? And it shifts things for everybody. So we're in the process of writing it, but I think for me, that's what happened in my work is I had to reclaim the caring process for myself and most importantly for my community, and as my other comadre Suzy Cepeda says, for future generations, for the people who are going to be reading this in the future. So
Wonderful. You just mentioned that the work of Gloria Anzaldúa really spoke to you or helped you through this process of, conceptualizing all these ideas into an quote unquote academic work.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a specific work of hers that you would say was most influential, or is it a collection of many?
Yeah, I think it's just her, Es muy cabrona, I also have a lot of, I think, empathy for her because she, in her last year, she was really sick and alone, and she left us such a body of work that I was like, wow, she endured so much to create this liberating space for us. Like, why don't I just jump into it as well? And, I didn't, I think I had a cognitive dissonance with Gloria's work initially, because obviously time has moved on, right? And we have access to knowledge and experiences that she may or may not have had had. So how the expressions of things, I think can sometimes, we all want to have our voice. And so, but Gloria, yeah, she gave me courage, right? And then it was a way to sort of honor her by taking part of her work, using her lens, but essentially inserting my voice and the voice of my community in what I created. So anything you read of hers is going to move you. It's like impossible not to.
Agreed.
So.
Agreed. Well, if you had to recommend one work for folks to get started on her legacy,
Borderlands. Yep.
There you go. Borderland is everyone's homework. How do you see? You said your work is now kind of a spirit, a living organism. What are some of the, let me rephrase that. I'm trying to make a good question of that. I'm curious to know, where do you see it going? Like how in its new life after the defense, what are the places where it can be read, where it can be explored, where it can be interacted with?
Well, I don't know exactly. I think like your invitation is one way that it just sort of, it's finding its own path. I also done a couple of presentations with students. I'm going to be talking to like education activist DePaul in a few weeks. I talked to a colleague this past week about how it can sort of serve as a premise or a concept for mental health practitioners. There's a lot of ideas. I think for me, I want to use it as a concept to one, responsibly respect sort of people reclaiming ancestral knowledge and traditions. And I like this to sort of maybe that it can serve as someone, Vanessa again said the elder bridge. I think if this concept can be a bridge that can help us preserve and act responsibly with our traditional knowledge and ceremonies, so that we do not professionalize sort of the reclaiming of our spirituality, right? And so for me, I don't want this work to be professionalized. I just want it to be a conversation. And hopefully, if it becomes a book, beautiful. If not, that's fine. If it's just a continued plática, that's beautiful. But my hope is that it's a tool to expand the conversation, and hopefully inspire other ways that we can narrate and reclaim sort of that space where we see all the intersections of who we are. So
Cool. How so you talk about how your work revolves around this bridging of the Indigenous knowledge and the art-based inquiry and the critical psychology. So I'm interested in hearing perhaps like an example of a way in which all of these things come together for that community activation?
I mean, I think it's happening all the time. I think for me, it's the easiest place I see that happens is within performance art, especially Indigenous performance art, like that you all are my heroes in so many ways. And again, my hermano Dakota Camacho, I think, is a perfect example, and also the work of Jack Gray, and the list goes on and on. And this conversation with the students from Guam, I'm still sitting with it and still inspired with it, just because he's giving them permission and inviting them to tap into their ancestral knowing and their lineages to create and to put forth, a new, their understandings of the world and of their communities, outside, not outside, but within the academia, right? And so the fact that they're opening and closing their classes via Zoom with a chant and movement, I think for me is, I mean, there's no words, because there's things happening that we won't know until they happen, right? Because we all show up in a space with different experiences, highs, lows, so forth, and something needs to give us that energy to move on, right? To wake up the next day. Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, whenever we were able to connect to the idea that we're breathing, we're here in the world for a purpose, that's a win. And to me, that's all of these things coming together, because there's so many things in the world that is trying to put us down, that literally is trying to kill us. And so, how we eat, how we work, literally now with the pandemic, how we relate to one another, there's so many threats. And so if we're able to use and tap into ancestral and creative knowledge and integrate it into our lives, like, I think that's a creative act, right? Your prayer is a creative act that helps you survive in this world. If we choose to eat less meat and eat more plants, that's also a creative act in terms of how we build nutrition, who we interact with, who are we talking to. Like, I don't necessarily think that they have to be these big manifestations, right? Mm-hmm. They can be small actions as well, simply to sort of how we think. And if they're bigger ones too, which we know people are doing these phenomenal things as well, that's beautiful. But for me, I think the bottom line comes to survival. And so for me, transterritorial spirituality is something about helping us survive and giving us the confidence and to liberate sort of our knowledge and our connection to our lineage, to the land, to the spaces of knowing within our mind, and with our soul, and most importantly, among one another.
Wow, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. When you started talking about this, you brought up how you see this very well, or very clear, in performance art, and specifically in Indigenous performance art. And as a performance studies former scholar myself, I guess I'm curious to hear from your perspective, what is it about art that do we need art as a framework, as a word that helps us liberate and free ourselves to express, or does art need us to exist?
It's funny you say that. Like, again, art is one of those invented, like, where do these words come from, right? And right. One of my teachers, Sandy Saucedo, always would remind me, in Aymara and many Indigenous languages, the word art doesn't exist because it's just about living, right? And so, yeah, art is everything, right? And I think sometimes we forget how we craft our days and our habits. There's an art to it. We can be as creative or as subtle as we want to be. And there's something beautiful about that, because again, for me, it's about survival. So, I think art is everything, right? And I think sometimes we forget how we craft our days and our habits. There's an art to it. We can be as creative or as subtle as we want to be. And there's something beautiful about that, because again, for me, it's about survival. So, I mean, I think in terms of like culture in art and what's happening, because I do work with a lot of artists, and I see art in those realms sort of being contemporary manifestations of spirit. I was what, yeah, I mean, we can, there's so many, it's like the music, performance, visual art, you know, dance, the list goes on. And I think those manifestations of life are just sort of expressions and articulations of everything that's happening all the time, right? Or things that spirit wants to catch our attention, right? Like we need a big boom of whatever colors sometimes to remind us, you know, or to move something in us. I think art in terms, you know, my friend Caribbean Fragosa just wrote a book, a series of short stories, Eat the Mouth That Feeds You, and I recommend everybody to check out. But I can't wait to read it because it's sort of like a post Anzaldúa, post Acuña, post Sandra Cisneros of this integration of spirit world, our understanding of life and death, and how our imaginations operate in the world. And it's really, it's an art. Writing is an art to acknowledge things that maybe get unacknowledged or are invisibilized due to our dominant structures of knowing and expressing to one another. So yeah, that, I think that's how I see art is sort of it's art ruptures sort of the shell, and it allows us to sort of go deeper into the things that sometimes are shoved into a corner because of capitalism, or how the dominant world wants us to relate and act and communicate with one another.
I appreciate you sharing all of that with us. I am looking at the time and being mindful. I want to start wrapping this up, but first I want to ask you if, number one, is there a place where folks can read your dissertation, or is there a place where folks can read more of your work?
Soon there will be. I mean, anybody's welcome to write me. You can send me a message via Instagram or reach out to you and put out my email. My dissertation will be uploaded to ProQuest hopefully by May, and then you know, I'm happy to send anybody a copy of it who wants to read it. And then I'm also happy to have conversations just one-on-one with people. I think generosity of time is really important, and I always learn from sharing the work with other people. So yeah, just get at me, and then we'll see where it goes. I'll definitely do a book proposal, but I'm working with some mentors on how to figure that out right now. Beautiful.
And there's always self-publishing.
Yeah, también. Yep.
Luckily.
I do want, if I don't publish the book, I do want to self-publish the testimonials of the participants, just because they're such rich stories, obviously with their collaboration.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Are there any upcoming projects that you have that we can all start getting excited about and look forward to?
Well, I mean, I think it's really just trying to keep this conversation of transterritorial spirituality alive, which I ultimately, I like to see it to expand into this concept of transterritorial citizenship. Just because, as you know, as I think about how, you know, what we're living right now, how we think about our cities and communities, I know a lot of professionals who think and I work with and who are doing things, but they can't necessarily be explicit about it in their sort of professional environment. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think if we invite sort of terrains of speaking, or territories of psyche, territories of like multiple and conflicting histories, territories of looking at intergenerational trauma, to larger conversations, politics, planning, mental health, hospital administration, and the list goes on and on. I really think that we can move to a model of citizenship where we actually are more mindful and caring of one another, so that we can advance the sustainability of our planet.
Thank you so much for that. I hope we get to hop back in here in a year to talk about transterritorial citizenship, because yes, that is certainly it. I mean, right now I'm just processing those words together and how that makes so much organic sense in my body. Also as a person who is transterritorial, because I was born here, grew up there, came back here, and always navigating that in between, right? Of belonging and creating what that means for myself. So thank you, hermana, gracias. This was so wonderful. Thank you everyone who joined. I hope you go and follow Angela's work. And I put her handle on the comments. It's ojo ojo, which basically means I, as in these eyes. I. Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, no, las Gamati, again, I just want to close with an ofrenda, some sabia to all of the spirits and the hearts that listen. There's some amazing people on this lining. And to you, Gabi, Gawacha, for your initiative, your offerings of just pure energy and good intentions. And again, exploring responsibly, it's the concept and the question itself, I think, can move us in so many ways. So gracias, and pues ometeo.
Appreciate it. Ometeo también. Thank you, everyone. This was an episode of Exploring Responsibly. I'm Gabachia, your host, and I want to thank you all again for being here. We'll see you next month. Or actually, no, wait, we'll see you next week. Well, next month in English, but next week, if you want to join into a version of this conversation in Spanish, for all of you who are practicing bilingual or just curious about language, you'll be welcome. So I'll be here again on Tuesday at the same time with Angela in Spanish, and then I'll be releasing the lineup for the rest of the year soon. So stay tuned, everyone. Ciao.
Okay. Ciao.
Exploring Responsibly is 100% generosity powered, so please go and check out our guests' work and support them. All relevant links can be found in the show notes. If you want to support this space further, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/Gabachia. I'm Gabachia, your host, and I once more want to thank you for being here.